Hello class, welcome back to Bio 111. Today we are covering chapter 3, which is water and life. So in this chapter we're going to talk about how water is a very strange compound compared to a lot of other molecules on Earth. Water acts in a very strange way, and we'll talk about how, because water acts so strangely, it is essential for living things. Water is what makes life possible on Earth. Life cannot exist without the presence of water. You probably know that if you go without water for a week, you would die, right? You would die within less than a week without consuming water. Additionally, our bodies are mostly made of water. Humans are 70% water as a whole, but depending on what part of the body we're talking about, that percentage will vary. For instance, the human brain, which is arguably the most important part of the human body, is 85% water. The heart is 80% water, our skin is 75% water, and even our bones, the most solid parts of our body, are 25% water. So that shows us how vital water is to our survival. So you might ask, well, why is that? Why are these water molecules so incredibly important for the survival of life? Well, one of those reasons is that water is the only substance that exists in all three states of matter in the natural environment. So it exists in solid form, liquid form, and gas form. That's very rare for a substance, but we see it in the natural world. Water exists in solid form in the form of glaciers, ice. It exists in liquid form in lakes, rivers, oceans. And it exists in gaseous form in the form of clouds. So we can see all three forms of water at any given time in any given place on Earth. And that is very unique. Most substances do not have that. Water also has several unique emergent properties. We talked about emergent properties last time. You probably remember that emergent properties are properties that are unique to that substance, right? So water is made out of oxygen and hydrogen. Oxygen and hydrogen alone have their own specific properties, but when they come together to form water, there are different properties of water molecules that either oxygen or hydrogen did not have on their own. So those are the emergent properties of water, and we're going to see how those emergent properties are very, very important to living things. And then lastly, all of these things, including emergent properties, are due to the unique structure of a water molecule. Water molecules have a very particular structure which allows them to interact with other molecules in a very unique way. That, more than anything else, is what makes water such a unique molecule, and that's the main reason that living things rely so much on these water molecules. Every other substance on Earth, other than water, freezes from the bottom up. Solid forms of matter are usually much denser than their liquid forms. So when something freezes, typically it's going to be denser than it would be if it was liquid, so it will sink and the liquid will float on top of it. Water doesn't work that way. When water freezes, it freezes from the top down, because liquid water is actually denser than solid water in the form of ice. So ice is less dense than its liquid counterpart, which allows it to float. That flotation of ice allows fish and other aquatic organisms to survive during the winter months. For instance, you might have seen if a pond is frozen over, typically the fish at the bottom will still be somewhat active because the water underneath that ice is still liquid. This also allows predators to use the ice as a hunting mechanism. For instance, polar bears and seals will often sit or stand on top of the ice and use it as a method of preying upon the organisms that are swimming below them. Water also has a high surface tension. Now that basically means that it's very difficult to break water molecules apart from one another. The fact that the water has this very high surface tension allows the basilisk, otherwise known as the Jesus Christ lizard, to run across the water's surface, hence the name. There are also many water bugs that depend on water's high surface tension. You've probably seen some of them, those bugs that just walk across the surface of the water. Water also absorbs heat and cold without changing its own temperature very much. That is important for maintaining our atmosphere in both the winter and summer months. So we, as a globe, we don't change temperature all that much between winter and summer. And that's because the water that is surrounding us on this planet can absorb those changing temperatures and make it much more subtle for us than it would be otherwise. This particular fact is also very good because of climate change. If water changed temperature very easily, then we would have many more problems with ocean warming than we currently have. The ocean warming is an ongoing problem, but we're actually very lucky because if water was not the way that it is, if water did have the ability to change temperature very easily, then the ocean warming would be a much bigger problem, and we'd really have to figure something out much, much faster. So why is water strange? Why does water do these things when other molecules don't do them? Well, there are many factors that cause this weirdness of water molecules. Water molecules are V-shaped. If you look at the picture here, you can kind of see that V shape. This is a space-filling model, but you can see the oxygen on the bottom and the two hydrogens coming off of either side. Those two hydrogens are attached to that one oxygen through polar covalent bonds. Now, if we remember from the previous chapter, polar covalent bonds are covalent bonds, meaning that the two atoms are sharing electrons, but their electronegativity is not the same. In this case, oxygen has a lot more electronegativity than hydrogen does. What that means is that these electrons are going to be orbiting that oxygen more often than they will be orbiting those hydrogens. So that's what makes water's bonds polar. Now, these polar covalent bonds are responsible for almost all of the unique properties of water. So just to review, we talked last time about hydrogen bonding as well. Hydrogen bonds are weak bonds that occur between two molecules that are polar, right? These molecules have to be polar for these hydrogen bonds to form because they need to have that unequal sharing of those charges. So in this case, the oxygen has a partial negative charge because the electrons tend to orbit around that oxygen more frequently than they orbit around the hydrogens. The hydrogens, conversely, have that partial positive charge because the electrons orbit around those hydrogens less often than they orbit around the oxygen. So, because we have an oxygen with a partial negative charge and a hydrogen with a partial positive charge, we see a hydrogen bond forming between two different water molecules. The hydrogen section of one water molecule is attracted to the oxygen section of another water molecule. And so that causes this temporary bond because it will be broken as soon as those electrons shift in their positions. So these hydrogen bonds are temporary, but they are numerous. They happen very, very often. So because these bonds are constantly breaking and forming, they are, again, very, very fragile. They're only about 1/20th as strong as covalent bonds. And each hydrogen bond only lasts a few trillionths of a second. At any moment, most water molecules, though, are hydrogen bonded to their neighbors. That's why these hydrogen bonds matter. Even though they're temporary, they are very, very numerous. So if you were to take a picture of the water molecules in a single glass of water, at any given moment, you would see most of them are hydrogen bonded together. So even though these bonds are temporary, the fact that they are so numerous means that they do have an impact on water as a whole. And we're going to see what that impact is as we talk about the emergent properties of water. Now, these are some of the emergent properties of water. It has the cohesive behavior, ability to moderate temperature, expansion upon freezing, and versatility as a solvent. And we will talk about each of these a little bit more in depth as we continue in this lecture. So first, water's cohesive properties. Now, we already mentioned that water has very high surface tension. That happens because water molecules are hydrogen bonded both to one another and to the water molecules below them, but they are not hydrogen bonded to the air above them. So this hydrogen bonding results in water behaving as though it were covered in an invisible film similar to plastic wrap. That's what makes water so difficult to break, right? It's difficult to breach the surface of water. We humans can accomplish it because we are very large and very heavy, but this lizard, as you can see, has the ability to just run straight across the surface without actually breaking into that water. And that's again because of that very high surface tension. This lizard is known as a basilisk, otherwise known as the Jesus Christ lizard, and he uses the high surface tension of the water to run across it. So how does he accomplish this? Well, he does it by maximizing his surface area that comes into contact with the water. So essentially, he wants as much of his body to touch this water as possible, because that's going to spread out his weight a little bit more evenly and make it easier for him to run across. The way he accomplishes that is that he has these specialized flaps on his feet that can unfurl, and he slaps the water with those. That creates air pockets that can support his weight due to, again, that high surface tension of water, as long as the lizard maintains enough speed to move across without falling in. Now, in talking about cohesion, we also have to talk about adhesion. So cohesion is these water molecules bonding to one another, right? So cohesion is water molecules sticking together. Adhesion is water molecules sticking to other materials. Cohesion and adhesion can work together to provide water to trees. So as an example, to show you the difference between cohesion and adhesion, we will talk about how they can result in trees getting enough water. Trees use both of these properties of water to stay hydrated and make sure that their leaves don't dry out in the sun. So the way this works is when water evaporates from the tree leaves, the properties of cohesion and adhesion pull the water upward through the trunk to replace that water from the leaves. This is similar to beads on a string, right? So essentially, the adhesion property of water will stick these water molecules to the inside of the trunk, right? The inside of the trunk is coated in hydrophilic substances, which means substances that are attracted to water. So in other words, polar substances. So the inside of this trunk has polar substances lining it. So these water molecules will be attracted to those polar substances. That is adhesion. They'll stick to the sides of the trunk. Then we have cohesion of the water molecules sticking together. What that means is that as water molecules evaporate from the leaves, other water molecules are going to move up to take their place because the water is all sticking together, right? So the adhesion is keeping the water molecules in this trunk, in this straight line. Cohesion is pulling them one after the other, like beads on a string, right? So both of these processes are going to keep this water flowing, and make sure that the water can make it up into those leaves without being lost, right? So the water is continually flowing up this trunk and into the leaves, and that is again because of both cohesion and adhesion. Now the next property of water we're going to talk about is water's ability to moderate temperature. Now water has this ability to absorb heat in the summer, staying cold, and then it can release that heat in the winter. Now, to understand what I'm talking about, think about the ocean, right? If anybody's ever gone to the beach and swam in the ocean, you know that the best time to swim in the ocean is late in the summer, August or even September, because that's when the ocean's going to be the warmest. Now, why is that? Well, that's because water can absorb a lot of temperatures and it stays relatively constant. What that means is that in early summer, the water is going to be cooler than the air because the water has absorbed all of that colder temperature of the winter. By the end of summer, the water has warmed because it's absorbed a lot of that heat from the summer months. Conversely, when it starts to become winter, the water will then be warmer than the surrounding air because it's so used to the warmer temperatures of the summer. So that's how water can moderate temperature, right? Water stays relatively constant even while the seasons change around it. So why does water do this? Well, to understand that, we need to first talk about energy, and specifically the energy of heat. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Anything that moves has kinetic energy. Now, anything that moves also includes atoms or molecules. Atoms and molecules all have this random motion, right? Molecules move around randomly. Solid objects have very tightly packed molecules that don't have very much space to move. Liquids have slightly looser packed molecules that have space to move around a little bit more and also to move a little bit faster than the solids did. Gases have very loosely packed molecules, so they have the space to move around very rapidly. The faster the molecules move, the hotter the substance is. Now, this random movement of atoms and molecules is known as thermal energy. So, because the faster the molecules move, the hotter the substance is, from that we can determine that temperature is actually a measure of energy. When we're talking about temperature, we're actually talking about the average kinetic energy of the molecules that make up that body of matter. Thermal energy, on the other hand, is the total kinetic energy of these molecules. So temperature is the average kinetic energy, whereas thermal energy is the total kinetic energy. So these are a little bit different. So to explain the difference between thermal energy and temperature, let's think about the difference between a cup of coffee and a swimming pool. The cup of coffee is going to be much hotter than the pool, which means that it has a higher temperature. Therefore, the molecules of that coffee are moving much faster than the molecules of the pool. On the other hand, the pool is going to have a higher thermal energy because the pool has more volume. There are more total molecules making up that pool than there are making up the cup of coffee. Therefore, the pool will have a higher thermal energy, a higher total kinetic energy of the molecules, whereas the cup of coffee will have a higher temperature or average kinetic energy. Right, so that's going to be the difference between these two terms. Now, thermal energy that's being transferred from one body of matter to another is what we call heat. Heat transfers between bodies of matter. So, as a matter of fact, ice cubes don't actually add coolness to drinks. Rather, they absorb the thermal energy from the liquid because they have a lower thermal energy themselves. So that is how heat is transferred. It's always going from something with a higher thermal energy to something with a lower thermal energy. Now, when heat is transferred, it is transferred in calories, kilocalories, or joules. The first two are going to be the ones we really focus on. The latter is typically used in physics, so you don't need to worry too much about it just yet. A calorie is the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. We're going to be working with calories in this class. It's also the amount of heat released when 1 gram of water cools by 1 degree Celsius. So basically, any change in the temperature of water by 1 degree Celsius is a calorie. Now, when you see the word calories on food packages, that's actually referring to kilocalories or kcals. Calorie is a very low level of energy, and so when we are working with calories in food, we are typically referring to kilocalories, which are worth 1,000 regular calories. And again, the joule is also a unit of energy, but we'll typically see joules more often in physics, and we'll use calories more often in biology. The specific heat of a substance is the amount of heat that needs to be absorbed or lost in order for 1 gram of that substance to change its temperature by 1 degree Celsius. So essentially, it's the amount of heat that we need to input in order to change the temperature of a substance. So the specific heat of water is 1 calorie per gram per degree Celsius. That means that we need 1 calorie of heat in order to change 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. That is a relatively high specific heat, especially when you compare it to that of other substances. For instance, the specific heat of alcohol is only about 0.6 calories per gram per degree Celsius. So water's specific heat is almost twice that of alcohol. We can think of specific heat as a measure of how well a substance is able to resist changing its temperature when it absorbs or releases heat. So because water has a high specific heat, that means that water is very good at resisting changing its temperature. It takes a lot of energy to change the temperature of water. Heat has very little effect on the temperature of water because most of the energy of heat gets absorbed when hydrogen bonds break. So essentially, we're answering the question here, well, why is it that water can absorb so much heat? And the answer is because of its hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds, as I mentioned, are very temporary. They break and form constantly. When water heats up or cools down, that also influences how often these bonds break and form. For instance, if we heat up water, the molecules start to move more rapidly. That's going to break a lot of those hydrogen bonds, right? If the water molecules are moving more rapidly, they're not going to be able to sustain as many hydrogen bonds with one another. As those bonds break, they're going to absorb some of that excess heat, right? So when hydrogen bonds break, they absorb heat. So as you heat up water, those hydrogen bonds are going to break more often, absorbing the heat and cooling the water back down. Conversely, if you try to cool water, if you try to freeze it, then those water molecules are going to stop moving around so much. They're going to slow down, which allows them to form more hydrogen bonds with one another, which will in turn release some heat, right? So as these hydrogen bonds form, they release heat, and so that's going to warm the water back up. And so you can see how these hydrogen bonds, in their breaking and their formation, they are influencing what's happening to the water temperature. So they're essentially balancing out that water's temperature. That's what gives water such a high specific heat. That's why it's so difficult for us to heat water up or cool water down. You've probably seen that when you try to boil water in the kitchen, it takes a while, right? Anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes to boil a pot of water. That's because water has this very high specific heat. It takes a lot of heat to properly boil that water. Now, a large body of water, such as a lake or an ocean, can absorb and store a large amount of heat from the sun during the day and during the summer, while only warming up a few degrees itself. At night and during the winter, the water cools very gradually, and as it does so, it can warm the air. That's going to stabilize ocean temperatures, which results in a good environment for marine life. It also keeps temperature fluctuations on land within the limits that will allow for living things. So really, the only reason that we have life on this planet is because we have these bodies of water to help moderate the planet's temperature. And because organisms are mostly composed of water as well, they are also able to resist these large-scale temperature changes. Right? Water making up our bodies is going to help us withstand any temperature changes that might occur. The ocean temperature also has a cooling effect on land air temperatures. So to explain that, I've got this picture here. This picture shows us the average temperature of the various cities on land during the summer. So we see that if the city is closer to the coast, it has an average temperature of much cooler than the cities that are further inland. That's because the cities that are close to the coastline have that water there. The water is able to moderate that land temperature and cool it off during the summer. And lastly, the evaporative cooling is our fourth property of water that we're going to discuss here. Now, molecules of a liquid move faster than the molecules of a solid, right? We stated that already. But they stay together because they are attracted to each other. When they move fast enough, they will eventually overcome those attractions and break apart. That's what transforms the matter from liquid to a gas state. So this is the process of either evaporation or vaporization. The heat of vaporization is the heat that a liquid needs to absorb in order for 1 gram of that liquid to be converted to gas. The heat of vaporization is related to the high specific heat of water. Water needs to absorb a lot of heat in order to change from liquid to gas, which means that it has a high heat of vaporization. In other words, the temperature that it needs to reach in order to convert to gas is very high. The fact that water has this very high heat of vaporization is what helps to moderate the Earth's climate. A large portion of solar heat, heat from the sun, will be absorbed as seawater evaporates. So as a liquid evaporates, its remaining surface will cool, through a process called evaporative cooling. So evaporative cooling happens because the fastest and therefore the hottest molecules are the first ones to evaporate. That will in turn leave the cooler molecules remaining in the liquid, and those will then gradually heat up as well. This process of evaporative cooling helps to stabilize lake and pond temperatures, and the evaporative cooling of sweat and dew is what keeps animals and plants from overheating. So this is a very useful property of water. This is going to be the end of part 1 of this lecture, so I will see you guys next time where we will continue talking about water's properties and finish up part 2 of this lecture.